The morning I came back to my cabin, everything was gone. No roof, no walls, just splinters, sawdust, and a yellow tape fluttering in the wind. The HOA had demolished my home, illegally. No notice, no hearing, no warning. Just gone. They said I was out of compliance, that my cabin disrupted the visual harmony of the neighboring properties. But what they didn't know, that my cabin sat on top of a private well. And that well? It fed the 1,000 head sheep ranch the HOA leased and depended on for massive subsidies. So I made a call, filed the paperwork, shut off the flow, and within days, their sheep were thirsty, their fences were empty, and their little HOA empire began to crumble. Because they didn't just demolish my home, they destroyed their own lifeline and didn't even know it. Some people escaped to the mountains. Others head to the coast. For me, peace came in the form of an old, off-grid cabin nestled just beyond the edge of an HOA-controlled ranch development. I bought the place 7 years ago. It was quiet, remote enough to hear the wind shift through the trees, but close enough to the edge of town that I could make the trip in under an hour. The best part? It came with a natural well, tapped decades ago, that supplied clean, crisp groundwater through a simple solar pump system. No city lines, no meters, no HOA, just solitude, a porch swing, and the freedom to be left alone. My neighbors, if you could call them that, lived across a wide pasture that stretched out to a rolling livestock ranch owned and maintained by the local HOA. Their board had struck a deal years back to lease the land to a sheep operation with over 1,000 head of livestock, managed by a handful of contractors. I kept to myself, maintained my fence, kept the brush low, my footprint minimal. At first, everything was fine. I'd get the occasional friendly notice from the HOA, little flyers tucked under my gate or taped to the dirt road post. They were always passive-aggressive in that HOA way. Your cabin's exterior color is inconsistent with the surrounding community palette. Please ensure your water tanks aren't visible from the Ridgeline Trail. We remind all residents, full-time or not, that visual harmony protects our shared values. I never responded. I didn't have to. They had no legal jurisdiction over my land. The property predated the HOA by decades. It was carved out under a different zoning code, and the boundaries were clearly drawn in county records. I wasn't a member, I didn't pay dues, and I didn't need their permission to live quietly. Still, the notices kept coming. Then they escalated. In one letter, the HOA accused me of unauthorized development, referring to a modest tool shed I'd built next to my well. Another warned of potential visual code violations. I laughed them off. Nothing in their rules applied to me. But Karen, the HOA president, didn't seem to care about the law. Only control. I'd met her once, briefly, when she tried to walk up to my porch uninvited. "This isn't community-friendly," she said, pointing to my unpainted siding and firewood stack. "You should consider improvements." "I'm not part of your community," I said flatly. "And I like it how it is." That was the end of it, or so I thought. Then came the weekend, everything changed. I had gone out of town for 4 days to visit family. When I returned, I knew something was wrong the moment I turned down the gravel road. There were tire marks, heavy ones, bulldozer tracks, oil stains. And when I rounded the bend where my cabin used to stand, there was nothing. No woods, no porch, no shed, just a pile of splintered timber, crushed beams, and shattered glass. My solar panels? Smashed. My water tanks? Dismantled. The wellhead, thankfully underground, was capped with a metal plate I didn't install. There was no fire, no flood. This wasn't nature. This was demolition. I stood there frozen, heart pounding. I found a folded paper nailed to what remained of the fence post. Non-compliant structure removed per Section 12B of HOA code enforcement. No city seal, no permit number, just a typed HOA header and a signature. Karen L., Wellington, President. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, breathing dust and disbelief. They'd done it. They'd actually destroyed my home. Without notice, without warning, without legal authority. I called the sheriff. He arrived within the hour, walked the property, and whistled low. "You say they did this?" he asked, pointing at the rubble. "They left a note. I said, handing him the document. He read it, then narrowed his eyes. You're not under their jurisdiction. Nope. He shook his head. You want to press charges? I nodded once. Then I went home. Not to the cabin, what was left of it, but to my backup place in town. And I started digging. First, my deed. I already knew what it said, but I needed specifics. The land I owned had been part of a multi-parcel ranch back in the 1950s. It had since been split and sold in pieces, but my lot retained one very unique feature: a registered easement and legal ownership of a groundwater well known as Well 4A. I pulled the records from the county archive and stared at the scan. Well 4A, established 1954, depth 220 feet, current operator parcel. Hashtag 384. That was my parcel. I read further. In the 1980s, when the HOA's ranch land was developed and leased out to livestock operations, the developers had negotiated use of the existing well via an easement agreement. But the well was never transferred. It was leased, with renewals. And the last renewal? It expired 3 months ago, which meant the well now belonged to me, uncontested and unencumbered. And that same well, it fed every water line on the ranch. The troughs, the irrigation misters, the entire support system for the 1,000-head sheep operation the HOA took so much pride in. Karen had leveled the only house sitting on the legal water source for their entire livestock operation. And I didn't even have to lift a finger. They'd done it to themselves. The irony burned. They'd spent months harassing me about my visual harmony and non-compliance, convinced they could erase me with a backhoe and a forged notice. But in their arrogance, they forgot to check one thing. Who owned the water? And now I did. The well, the valve, the pressure system. Every drop flowed through me. And if they thought they could destroy my cabin and still expect me to keep supplying their thirsty empire, they had another thing coming. The day after I stood in the ruins of my home, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about proof. HOAs like this one survive on one thing: plausible authority. They send official-looking letters, wear little name tags, quote pages from rulebooks that look like law. But all of it depends on one thing: people not knowing better. I knew better. And now, with a demolished cabin, a capped well, and a signed letter from Karen Wellington herself, I was ready to start digging, not just through county records, but through every layer of this HOA's fake authority. My first stop was the county building office. I walked up to the clerk's desk with a photo of the rubble and Karen's demolition notice. I need to pull permit records for parcel 384, I said. She tapped her keyboard. 1 SEC, okay. That's your land. Was. Until last week. She frowned. Let me check. I watched as her brow furrowed. There are no permits for demolition. No record of anything being authorized in that location. You said the HOA did it. They taped this to the wreckage. I handed her the non-compliant structure removed notice. She looked it over, then looked back up at me. They're in serious trouble. I made a copy of her search results and left with the printout. No permits. No versast. Just destruction. Next, I visited the Zoning and Land Jurisdiction Department. This time, I brought my deed and the original parcel map from the 50s, showing my land as a separately zoned lot, never incorporated into the HOA subdivision that later popped up around it. The zoning officer, a no-nonsense guy named Rich, took one look at the paperwork and shook his head. This is a clean, grandfathered parcel. You're completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. So they had no right to enforce anything on me? Not unless you voluntarily opted into their code. And based on your records, you didn't. I didn't even know I was near them when I bought the place. He nodded. They didn't just act outside their authority. If they ordered a demolition, that's criminal trespass and destruction of private property. That was confirmation number 2. Then came the kicker. I walked across the hall to the County Utilities and Resource Registry, where I pulled a file on well for the old groundwater well that had served my property since the Eisenhower era. The woman behind the counter, Dana, was the kind of person who could recall a water line's install date by memory. She pulled the file, and her eyes went wide. "Oh, this well's famous," she said. "You're the registered operator?" "I am now." She laid out the documents, clear as daylight. Well 4A was drilled in 1954. It was located entirely within parcel 384, my parcel. The rights were registered under my name. And in the 1990s, the HOA signed a lease agreement to use water from the well, first for landscaping, then, later, for livestock support when they expanded into the sheep operation. The last lease renewal expired 3 months ago. They never filed for an extension, meaning I now held 100% ownership and control of the well, and they had no current rights to access it. I asked Dana a careful question. If someone capped this well or attempted to modify it without my consent, she didn't let me finish. That's a violation of state water access law. It's a protected utility. Anyone tampering with it could face fines or even charges. I took the printed copy of the lease expiration, my ownership registration, and the confirmed location map. My binder of evidence was growing thick, but I wasn't done. Next, I visited the ranch. It wasn't hard to find the foreman. His name was Clyde, a leathery old cowboy type who'd worked livestock longer than I'd been alive. I introduced myself, and when I said I owned the property with well 4, his eyes lit up. "You're the guy with the pump valve?" he asked. "We've had low pressure for 2 weeks. You know where the water comes from?" "Yeah, from that corner lot on the ridge. Didn't someone tear down a cabin up there?" "They did," I said, "without permission, and they capped the well." His jaw clenched. "That's why we've been hauling in backup tanks. That's our only source for this side of the ranch. Every trough, every hose line, they all run off that system." I asked if the HOA had told him the well was private. "Nope. They told us they had a shared use agreement in place. Said everything was fine." I showed him the lease document with the expiration date circled. "This agreement expired 3 months ago," I said. "You've been running your livestock off a system you don't have permission to use." He stared at the paper for a long time, then said, "They never told me. They destroyed the cabin, capped the well, and now they're depending on water they no longer control." He let out a low whistle. "You gonna shut it off?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'm making sure every step is legal before I do." That night, I returned home and laid everything out. Photos of the destruction. HOA letter with Karen's signature. No demolition permits filed. County zoning confirmation showing my parcel was autonomous. Water rights documents showing I owned well 4A. Lease expiration notice. Witness statement from the ranch foreman. City official acknowledgement of the HOA's lack of jurisdiction. Each piece wasn't just damning. Together, they were unstoppable. It was time to prepare the next move. But not out of rage, out of precision. I submitted formal notices to the county sheriff's office, reporting illegal demolition and trespassing. The Building Code Enforcement Office, reporting unauthorized destruction of permitted structure. The State Water Authority, reporting unauthorized capping and use of a registered well. The Agricultural Department, noting improper resource management at a livestock facility. A civil attorney, who agreed to take the case after seeing the first 3 documents. I wasn't going to just shut off the water. I was going to turn off every escape valve they thought they had. Karen and her board didn't just make a mistake. They demolished their only source of water. And they did it with a fake rule book and a smug signature, assuming no one would check. But I checked. And now the clock was ticking. There's a kind of silence that comes before collapse. Not peace. Not calm. Just stillness. The moment before weight snaps a beam or water pressure buckles a line. That's what it felt like the day I filed the final notice to the county. Revocation of third-party water access for well 4A, effective immediately. No violence. No shouting. Just a single notarized letter, stamped and delivered, with 2 supporting attachments. The expired lease showing the HOA no longer had rights to draw water from my well. The destruction report of my home, filed with the sheriff and building code office, demonstrating bad faith and trespass by the HOA. My attorney helped draft the language. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise. Due to the unlawful demolition of the dwelling located on parcel 384A by the HOA without jurisdiction or authorization, and the unauthorized tampering with and continued use of well 4A following lease expiration, This notice revokes any and all implied or historical permissions to access or draw from said well. Effective immediately, copies were sent to the HOA, the livestock leaseholder, and the county utilities register. Within 24 hours, I drove out to my land and installed a reinforced lock on the pump box and gate housing the solar-powered wellhead. I posted a new sign: private utility, no access without owner consent. Trespassers will be reported. I didn't post a threat. I didn't cut lines. I simply removed their permission to access what they'd been leaching for years. And within 72 hours, the water stopped. It began with a rumor, a text chain between ranch workers. Water lines dead. North troughs are bone dry. Pumps not pulling. Check the solar station. Then came the calls to the HOA office. Then came the panic. They hadn't prepared for this. Not because they didn't think it could happen, but because they never believed I had the guts to do it. Karen and her board thought I'd beg for compensation, or maybe sue and settle quietly. But I didn't want money. I wanted them to feel the slow, creeping panic of consequence. Within a week, the sheep ranch was in disarray. The livestock contractors had no water for over 1,000 head. Portable tanks were trucked in at massive cost. 2 herders quit. One sent me an anonymous thank you note that read, "They've been cutting corners for years. You gave us a reason to walk." Then came a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello. This is Karen Wellington," the voice snapped. I almost laughed. "Karen, nice to hear from you. I understand you've revoked access to the water system. This is legal, documented, and overdue. You can't do this. There are animals depending on that well." "You mean the same animals supported by the ranch that benefits your HOA's bottom line? The same ranch whose board just bulldozed my legal dwelling without cause?" There was silence. "Karen," I said evenly, "you capped my well and destroyed my home. And now you're surprised the faucet is off. You'll regret this," she said finally. "No, you will," I replied. "In fact, I think the public might regret it with you." That afternoon, I reached out to the same reporter who had covered our local zoning scandal a year earlier. She jumped at the story. The headline 2 days later read, "HOA destroys cabin, loses access to water feeding 1,000 head sheep ranch. Resident responds with legal shutdown." The photo was brutal. A before and after shot of my cabin beside the wreckage, overlaid with an image of parched sheep next to dry troughs. The article was worse for them. It laid everything out. My off-grid cabin, legally permitted and outside HOA control. The illegal demolition ordered by the board. The expired water lease. My formal, city-backed revocation of water access. And the immediate impact. A failing ranch operation, rising fines from agriculture boards, and a fractured HOA leadership trying to spin the story. Within 48 hours, the article went viral in local circles. Farmers and landowners from surrounding counties started chiming in online. About time someone hit back at these HOAs. You don't bulldoze someone's home and expect a handshake. He didn't cut their water, they cut their own. The comment section was relentless. Karen tried to do damage control. The HOA released a statement calling me a hostile actor weaponizing resource control and claimed my water system had never been fully independent. But the county water office responded with a statement of its own. Parcel 384A is the sole registered holder of water rights for Well 4A. No current lease or authorized draw exists for any adjacent parcels. Enforcement of private property and utility rights remains with the landowner. Translation: game over. The community began turning. Residents who'd once ignored HOA politics were now demanding answers. Why had the board authorized demolition without permits? Why hadn't they renegotiated the lease if the well was essential? Why was the HOA pouring resources into defending a board president who just cost the neighborhood its most profitable lease? The HOA couldn't answer any of it. The contractors working the sheep ranch were livid. Their paychecks were bouncing. The city's agricultural board launched a formal investigation into livestock neglect. Then came the State Department of Natural Resources, investigating whether the HOA had intentionally drawn from the well post lease, which carried a stiff fine per gallon. Karen tried to hold a special HOA meeting. Only 10 people showed up. 7 of them left halfway through when she blamed the unforeseen nature of water rights lapses. No one bought it, because the truth was clear. They didn't lose the water. They lost me. And I wasn't some bitter recluse with a grudge. I was a landowner with documents, with rights, with receipts. And every time I shared those receipts, whether with reporters, agencies, or neighbors, Karen's house of cards sank deeper into the mud. One day, I got a call from the HOA treasurer, now acting president, after Karen vanished from public view. "We want to resolve this quietly," he said. "You mean now that your sheep are dying and your contractors are quitting?" There was silence. "We're willing to repurchase access to the well at a fair price." I thought for a long time, then said, "There is no price." He sighed. "We'll pay for the cabin." "No, you won't. You'll explain it to the courts." And I hung up. I didn't shut off the water to get rich. I shut it off to remind people like them what happens when they abuse power unchecked. And I made sure the community remembered it too. Every town meeting, every letter to the editor, every new water permit request tied to old HOA infrastructure, I flagged it, attended it, and educated others on how to defend their property lines. They wanted to erase me with a bulldozer. Instead, they built a monument to their own stupidity, one drought-stricken sheep at a time. For the first time in years, the HOA newsletter didn't arrive in a printed envelope or passive-aggressive email. It came as a press release, printed on plain white paper with no logo, no Karen signature, just a dull headline. Temporary suspension of livestock operations on HOA-leased pasture lands. Translation: the sheep ranch was shut down. By that point, most of the neighborhood already knew. You could smell it before you heard about it. The stench of dehydration, unwashed animals, and desperation. In just under 3 weeks, since I had legally revoked access to well 4, the ranch had lost control of its operation. With no reliable water, over 300 sheep had died, and another 500 were scattered across emergency pasture elsewhere. The photos in the local paper were brutal. Dry troughs, buckled fencing, malnourished livestock huddled under temporary tarps. And the caption beneath? "Water war between HOA and homeowner leads to livestock collapse." The fallout hit fast. The state's agricultural agency levied a $150,000 fine against the HOA for animal negligence. The fine included citations for unsanitary water containers, failure to supply potable water, and lack of contingency infrastructure, all of which had been flagged in Karen's email trail months before. Lawsuits came next, first from the livestock contractors who lost wages, stock, and equipment. Then from neighboring property owners whose wells were tainted by rapid borehole attempts the HOA had rushed into without permits. And finally, from a class action group of HOA residents who had no idea their fees were subsidizing a now-dead ranch operation built on stolen water. Karen tried to spin it. She showed up once, briefly, at a board meeting, where she claimed the well ownership issue was under review and that the livestock loss was a tragic but exaggerated consequence of an overreaction. That statement became her last as HOA president. By the following morning, she had resigned. But the damage was done, and her name wasn't just burned into our county. It had become synonymous with overreach. The county stepped in and ordered a full audit of the HOA's financial practices, lease records, and all enforcement activities from the past 5 years. That audit uncovered more than water violations. It revealed Karen had never filed the HOA's 501c for nonprofit annual reports for 2 consecutive years. The board had been collecting dues without providing proper accounting statements. Several lease renewals, including the expired livestock water lease, had never been signed, just assumed continued. In short, the HOA was operating on fumes and fiction. When the county's audit results went public, the remaining board members resigned within 72 hours. One board secretary posted her letter on the neighborhood forum. "I joined to plant flower beds, not bulldoze cabins or destroy farms. I had no idea what was happening. I am sorry." No one replied. The community didn't want apologies anymore. They wanted accountability. That's when the county revoked the HOA's land lease. Effective immediately, The HOA lost its rights to the shared ranch land they had maintained for over a decade. The property was returned to public trust to be reassessed and possibly transferred to agricultural cooperatives, with oversight this time. The announcement was read out loud at the next zoning meeting. I sat quietly in the back row while the commissioner read the line that mattered most. The parcel known as South Creek Ranch is no longer under HOA lease control due to gross negligence, environmental misconduct, and failure to uphold basic terms of agreement. When he said it, I didn't smile. I just closed my notebook, because this wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. They'd bulldozed my life into the dirt, and in doing so, they'd buried themselves. In the following weeks, I received 3 offers. One from a desperate ranching collective asking to lease water rights. One from a regional real estate group offering to buy the well outright and drill access for new developments. And one, surprisingly, from a state conservation agency asking if I'd be willing to donate the well land as part of a wildlife corridor restoration. I declined them all, not out of spite, but because what sat on that land wasn't just water anymore. It was proof. Proof that lines on a map mean nothing if you don't know who drew them. Proof that silence isn't submission, and that property, once claimed, has to be protected. And maybe most importantly, proof that when you're willing to dig deep, past the threats, the fake letters, and the concrete, what you find is something that can't be stolen. Rightful ownership. Karen moved out 2 months later. Her house went up for sale with a 1-line description. Motivated seller. Sold as is. No one attended the open house. Word had spread too far. Even the city's code compliance team showed up to inspect the property for abandoned enforcement materials, clipboards, flyers, and other leftover HOA junk that had been left in plastic bins on the porch. The day her for sale sign came down, I went out to my land. The well still stood, untouched, clean, and locked. The rebuild had already begun. The new cabin wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It just needed to stand. To exist, proudly and legally, on land no one could ever touch again. I installed a new plaque by the wellhead. A simple engraving. This is what happens when you push too far. There's something poetic about building again, especially on the same patch of land where everything was taken from you. Where there used to be splinters and silence, now stood new beams, raised clean and true. A rebuilt cabin. Simple. Strong. Mine. I didn't design it to be flashy. I didn't need symbols. I just wanted it to stand tall, not in defiance, but in quiet resilience. It took a crew of good people, local contractors, a few old-timers who remembered the original well dig, and even a couple neighbors who showed up just to say thank you. People who hadn't said much during the fight, but now came forward with coffee, tools, and even meals. You didn't just defend your land. One of them said, "You defended all of ours." That meant more to me than any court ruling or headline. The well was upgraded next. With help from a conservation engineer, I transformed it into a regulated, solar-powered, closed-loop system. Efficient, monitored, independent. It no longer just fed the land. It symbolized everything that made this place worth protecting. Freedom, sustainability, accountability. People began stopping by, not to trespass, but to ask how I'd done it. A rancher from the next county over asked about filing for private water security. A young family asked how to keep HOAs from creeping into deed restrictions. I shared every document, every step, every loophole they could close in advance. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. The land changed, too. Without the HOA breathing down its neck, the hills grew quiet again. No livestock trucks. No HOA board meetings. No fake patrols on ATVs. Just wind. Coyotes. Morning frost glinting off my new cabin's windows. The way it used to be. Locals started calling my place the shut-off shack. Half joke, half shrine. Someone once said at the feed store, "You don't mess with the guy who owns the water." Another added, "Especially when that guy's got the patience to wait and the guts to close the valve." I didn't ask for the legend, but I didn't fight it either. Because after everything, the letters, the bulldozers, the lawsuits, the fines, the resignations, the one thing that remained was truth. And the people who saw it, by the time summer rolled in again, The community had reshaped itself, not around control but cooperation. A few folks even proposed forming a co-op, not an HOA, but a voluntary group to maintain the roads, plant wildflowers, and support landowners. Nobody talked about fines. Nobody cared about paint colors. The only thing people respected now, ownership and the strength to defend it. And when anyone needed a reminder, they'd glance up at the ridge, past the creek, where the rebuilt cabin stood over the wellhead. Still locked, still legal, still mine. And this time, no one dared touch it. Sometimes, losing your home is the worst day of your life. You stand in the dirt, staring at the wreckage, wondering how anyone could take what was never theirs to touch. And sometimes, it's how you find out you've been holding the winning card all along. The day the HOA demolished my cabin, they thought they were sending a message. They didn't realize that under their boots was the very well they needed to survive. That beneath the boards they crushed was authority they never had. And in trying to erase me, they uncovered their own foundation, cracked, fraudulent, and completely exposed. See, power isn't about the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing your land, your rights, your boundaries, and having the patience to stand still while they walk themselves into collapse. So if someone tries to take what's yours, don't just rebuild. Find the roots. Trace the lines. You might own more than you think. And once you do, hold the line. Because when you're standing on the truth, no bulldozer can move you. And no clipboard can silence you. If someone destroys your house without cause, make sure the next thing they lose is the one thing they can't survive without.